Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Judith Giesberg, the author of Last Seen, The Enduring Search by Formerly Enslaved People to Find Their Lost Families. She's written or edited 6 books, is a professor of history and holds a chair at Villanova University, and is the director of the Last Seen Project. Thanks so much for being here, Professor Giesberg.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. There may not be any bigger penalty than being forced to be apart from a family member. Dr. Giesberg writes that during the American slave trade, around 1 million people were taken from their families in slave auctions, sold off, never to be seen again. We will get to the impact, of course, that had on the kidnapping victims themselves. But first, I want to ask Dr. Giesberg about the people willing to inflict that kind of pain on someone else. Do we have any evidence that the people running the auctions or the slave masters themselves ever felt guilty about what they had done to mothers, fathers, and children?
Great question to start us off with. Because the selling, buying and selling of people that characterized American slavery was such an essential part of the American economy. We know a lot of people were involved in it at all levels, from the decision to sell an enslaved person, somebody who was the enslaver originally, to the person who effected the sale, to the people who were in charge of force marching them from their homes in places like Virginia, North Carolina, down into the Mississippi Valley. We know that the sort of, the possibilities for people to be the people who were implicated in the search were quite numerous, and there were a lot of people along the way who made decisions to be part of it, to part of this slave trade. And we also know that there were elaborate sort of systems of denial in place that people used in order to sort of separate themselves from these awful decisions that they that they decided to make all the time. So enslavers created sort of this fiction that this kind of thing didn't hurt enslaved people as much as it would hurt, or they didn't feel it as deeply as white people did, and that any sort of emotional attachment they had with their children who were being sold away, or their parents, would fade over time, and that they wouldn't, there would be no long-term effects of something like being separated from your family. That's what they told themselves. That's what they told the world. And that, on some level was a way for people to continue to perpetuate this institution. But they also knew that was a lie, because they did a lot of, they did a lot of elaborate sort of planning to make sure that, they did a lot of lying and planning to make sure that people didn't have the opportunity to resist these trades, because they knew these sales, because they knew that the fiction that they told them, that these, that this didn't hurt enslaved people the same way it did white people, they knew it was a lie.
Did that psychological game that they were playing with themselves develop over time, or was it something that was essential to the creation of the whole scheme?
Yeah, we have a lot of evidence that by the mid 19th century, when slavery was a very mature institution, had been around in this country for, a century, more than a century, that people raised enslavers raised, the next generation of enslavers to expect and to anticipate that they would come into this position of mastery, and that they would, that was their, that was their lot in life, that they were, expected to assume the next sort of generation of people who enslaved others.
So
And so
same thing as the slaves themselves. It was also hereditary to be a slave master.
right. Yeah, yes, yeah, I think that's actually a good comparison. Yeah.
Mm. So it might be self-explanatory to explain why you focus this book on what you call the freedom generation, and you can explain that, but also explain how things changed for those who were forced away from their families when slavery ended. And I'm curious as to when you believe that slavery actually did end. Was it the moment the papers were signed by Abraham Lincoln um, and the Confederate generals at Appomattox, or is there another time in which slavery ended? Was it when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed?
That is the million-dollar question. It really
Well, I
is
don't.
because
If you answer it, I don't have
yeah.
the money to give you, so you're gonna.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's great. That's great. Well, let's try. Let's try. This is a
yeah,
free answer,
yeah,
and
yeah.
so
There you
it's going to be imperfect. So, it is not all at once, and there's not one moment. I think, the way we can sort of think of about emancipation is happening, a variety of ways. You can answer that question. You can answer that question from the perspective of self-emancipating slaves, right? And in that way, there's a history of self-emancipation from the very beginning, right? Of slavery. So the 17th and 18th century, we know people, certain numbers of people were always self-emancipating, and for them, their freedom happened the moment that they decided that they would free themselves. But it was also tenuous, and it was something that they had to continue to fight to preserve. In particular, as more laws were passed to protect the enslavers from people who were running away. So somebody like Ona Judge, right, who Erica Dunbar writes about, right? That's the question I always ask my students to think about with her. When did her freedom begin if George Washington to continue to pursue her for the rest of her
right. Are
life?
you really free? Yeah.
Right, exactly. If you're always looking over your shoulder and you're always sort of anticipating what will happen next. But then during the Civil War, people who as you know, right, people who escaped behind Union lines, right, that they might have anticipated arriving at these contraband camps or these refugee camps, that was the moment freedom began. But but that was contingent on the proximity to Union troops. So it was coming and going throughout this period. I do think it's important. I do think it's important to think about when it is written out. It's when the prohibition against slavery is written into the American Constitution with the 13th Amendment. I don't want to. I don't
Yeah.
want
Right. Right.
to.
That's another time that you could argue. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, right. Because that sets the nation on a very different course than it had been, in its previous life. This was the new Constitution. This was a new commitment to eradicating this institution that had been so central to the American economy.
There were a number of types of punishments that were used by slave masters. Some of them have been depicted in movies and books, and the goal was, of course, to enforce this system of slavery on the slaves themselves, to essentially say there's no option. Can you describe with what types of punishments there were? Anything from food deprivation to violence to humiliation. How did this all work in one kind of tandem to keep this going and to essentially to say to slaves, either you give up your life or you give up your freedom?
Yeah. Well, I think that starts, Evan, with the denial of family life. I think that we know today that people, if we sort of think about slavery as the 19th century trafficking, right? That this was a system of human trafficking that was everywhere legal, and then slowly became sort of illegal in parts of the country, but was still, tolerated, and you're right, and people were implicated in it. That that the we know today that, right, that people who are separated from their family members are much more likely to be trafficked and sold into situations where that kind of psychological and physical abuse is rampant. And so I feel like the first way to think about sort of the punishments or the ways that people were, disciplined in the institution of slavery was separating them out from their families. And then, of course, all those other things that you mentioned, right, are in play, right? Being, the sort of being told that you'll never see your family again and being dragged into the cotton fields, and then being forced to produce and forced to sort of increase one's production all the time that we know was part of the economy of cotton production in this new frontier in the Mississippi Valley. So we know from slaveholders' records that, that they kept very careful track of how much cotton they were produced. They were supposed to improve that number the weight of their cotton production every day, and when they didn't, they were subjected to all sorts of punishments.
And were there any laws? I mean, this might sound innocent of me, but were there any laws that required a slave master to not go too far? Was there any fear at all among slave masters that they could face a system of justice that said, hey, you can't just murder somebody even if it's a slave? Did that fear exist at all? Or did the government essentially say, you have a right to keep this system going?
There certainly were laws in place that, that were intended to, sort of mitigate the worst kinds of abuses within this institution, but we have no evidence to suggest that they worked to do that.
Yeah.
Right. Because we know that slaveholders disciplined and punished and tortured their slaves with impunity.
We're going to get to the newspaper ads that make up the crux of this book in a second, but I just want to set this up a little bit more. I want to ask, how did the slave trade work domestically once international trading was banned in 1808? What system was set up that allowed these family separations to occur?
Yeah, so we know from business records, which are sort of everywhere out in the open and public, that there was a very active trade of people, selling of people from sort of slave trading nexuses in the Upper East on the East Coast, that took them down, that in which people were taken to some of the biggest slave marketplaces, places like New Orleans, which we all know about, but other places that we don't think as much about, like Galveston was another kind of nexus for the slave trade. So there were several of those that that were well positioned to feed people into the Mississippi Valley where they were producing cotton. But there were a lot of sales, between those two places, or people could trade hands, often did trade hands several times between there. So you could come from someplace like Norfolk, Virginia, into Louisiana, and you could, you could be sold several times in between those two places. Yeah, and then, right, as we know from people who've written about this, Ed Baptist has written about this, Joshua Rothman has written about this, that we know that these big auction houses that operated in some of these major cities, took out ads in the newspaper of their own, in which they listed regular ads, in which they listed the people who were going to be coming up for sale. And described their sort of physical features and what they might offer to prospective buyers. We know too that that this was very public. This would happen in hotels or on street corners or places where people could see this there was nothing secretive or
You couldn't escape the slave trade.
No, and we know people talked about the coffles, and there were images of the slave coffles. That's the way that people were forced marched from a place like Virginia down into the Mississippi Valley, because they were chained together, at the neck, and at the ankle. And there were people described these all over the place. People saw them in Washington, D.C. So congressmen were out, on the steps of the Capitol having a break, and they saw the coffles pass them. And every place between there and the Mississippi Valley, people saw these coffles. So this was
I
nothing
believe Abraham Lincoln saw one pretty
talked about.
famously. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so This was a very, thriving economy in people that everybody who had eyes could see.
Can you describe the media that is so important to this story? Of course, there was word of mouth, but describe the system of newspapers that America had. We're, I guess, describing a long time here, several hundred years, but describe as best you can the newspapers in America at the most important part of your story. Who read what? How were these newspapers distributed, and how were the audiences defined by race for each newspaper?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, the newspaper, I mean, the sort of the really interesting sort of character in this book that maybe is underappreciated is the newspapers as a technology that, as you said, Evan, is not new at this time, but for Black communities in the South, right, to have access to these newspapers is new. And so for freed people, access to this medium is new. And the flowering of the Black press in the post-war South is really extraordinary. And that provides the medium for freed people who have been trafficked into the Mississippi Valley to send messages out to their families that they're still there and that they hope to find them again. And as you said, right, we know the history of newspapers were, or of course, very much affiliated with one political party or another political party. That Americans were avid newspaper readers in the 19th century. We know that because, right, people, right, are talking about politics there. They're talking about social things there. Soldiers are taking newspapers with them as they fight in the war. So they're very much a part of people's lives. And again, for Black readers, this is new for them to have this direct access, particularly for enslaved people, to be able to take pen to paper and write to the newspapers to talk about their families and who they hope to find.
When did former slaves or their families decide they had to resort to newspapers? Was there an assumption that a slave had been sold off to a faraway place, or was there a chance that someone was sold off to someone locally? Now, obviously, that's a broad term, but was there a potential that someone was just a few plantations down?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And I think the answer to that question is really in our thinking about what we call, people who look at this period call the grapevine telegraph, which was the informal system of surveillance and communication that enslaved people used to keep track of one another. So without access to the written word, and where it was strictly prohibited in many places, and with the sort of the sort of need to know when a trade was going to happen or when somebody was going to be sold, we know that enslaved people communicated with one another across plantations and across regions through the grapevine telegraph, which was, sort of informal passing of news and passing of rumors that could occur very locally, but could also come with people as they were, traveling in the coffle from someplace on the East Coast into the Mississippi Valley. So people kept track of one another, enslaved people did, and they passed word along whenever they could to others. And this was something that they did, very secretively. They did this so that white people didn't know about it and wouldn't know about it. But that also allowed them to have, when they went to the papers, they often had something to work with because they had heard something. So they had heard, for instance, and they'll say this in the papers, that I hear that she wound up in Texas. And so that they're operating on something that they have derived from this informal network of communication. And then they would go to the papers with that information, seeking confirmation or correction about about that data that they had collected.
It makes me emotional to hear all this. What if they couldn't read? Obviously, one of the rules was you couldn't, at least for in some cases, you couldn't teach a slave to learn to read, and you weren't allowed to learn to read. How much did that impact what ads were placed and whether ads were placed?
Really good question. In all the ways. So sometimes these ads, they're written in the third person, maybe because the person is writing them is choosing to do that, but that could also indicate that they were getting help with the ads, writing the ads. So we know that that's also very likely the case in these ads because they'll often refer to a third party, often a Black pastor who, to whom they want information, whatever they could be gleaned to send, right? They want it sent to a Black pastor, or a Black pastor has signed on to the ad or is helping them write the ad. So we know there were people who were helping them, and that could also be a teacher. It could be, right, it could be a U.S. colored troop soldier, Freedmen's Bureau agent. There were people who we know, freed people, enlisted to help them when they couldn't write. And we also know that the advertisements often say in them that one pastor will sign on to the ad and will say something like, "Pastors in your congregations, please read this to your congregations." So we know there was an assumption that these advertisements were going to be, the information in them would be passed both by written, by it printed in the newspapers, but also as in the Black churches on Sundays, that pastors would read them out loud, and in that way, right, the information in them and the appeals written by these people could reach whoever was listening, whether they read, whether they were able to read or not.
You can probably, because you've read so many of these, recite some of them by memory. I don't know if you have one in front of you, but I just want to ask, what was in the ads? What types of information would there be, and what clues did they hope to put together to jog somebody's memory or recognition of somebody who might be close by?
Yeah, sure. So, there some of the common information, and I'll pull one out just in case we want to you want more information after I answer this question. But the common information in the ads are the name of the person who's searching, and for the person that they're searching for, or people, oftentimes more than one person that they're searching for. And they describe the last place they saw them. That's the title of the project and the book. They try to capture that moment when they were separated from their loved one, and that usually they describe the place where they were when they last saw them, and the circumstances in which they were separated. So were they separated? When they were sold away. Sometimes these ads also describe separations that occurred when somebody was running away. And also separations that occurred when when a young man followed Union Army or was enlisted in the Union Army. So a separation that occurred at the point of somebody joining the U.S. Army. So there are all sorts of circumstances under which they were separated, and that's always that's in most ads they'll give you the specific cause of the separation. And then a lot of the ads will give us information about the enslavers. So they name the enslavers and and sometimes the traders, and they give us in that way more of a robust sort of trail of evidence that allows potential listeners or readers who are hearing about this to find them, and to also understand how they got from one place to the next. And also, who was making those decisions. So somebody like Hagar Outlaw, who's in chapter 2, describes the sale of all of her children by her enslaver, and she names him. His name is David Outlaw. Her name is Hagar Outlaw, so she still has his name, the name of her enslaver, as do all of her children. She names all of her children, and she talks about David Outlaw, but also the sort of people in his family who were selling off of her children. And then she says where she is. And so it's sort of an important kind of geographic marker, both, right, the sort of beginning one when they were all together and they were separated, and then where she is now and how she hopes to find them. But all of that information we can see or we can read as clues to people who are reading the ads or listening to the ads, so that they can identify her and find her.
This is a hair of an aside, but I want to ask: um, newspapers depend on advertisers for money, and to keep going. Was this an industry, an advertising segment that became a worthy revenue stream for newspapers and black newspapers in the South?
That's actually an important question
Oh,
because
okay.
it really is because the black newspapers, the way this works, right, is that black newspapers, some of the big black newspapers, one that was published out of Philadelphia called the Christian Recorder, another one that was published in New Orleans called the Southwest Christian Advocate, were associated with churches. So the one in Philadelphia is associated with the AME Church. Here in Philly, it's actually still published with that church. And the one that was published in New Orleans was associated with another Black Methodist church in New Orleans. And what both of those newspapers did was, a person took out a subscription to the newspaper, and then they were able to place ads for free in the newspaper. Other newspapers did this differently, and so sometimes newspapers publish them for free as just sort of a service to their congregations. But these were important decisions that Black newspapers had to make because they were always strapped for cash. And so, you'd actually see sometimes newspapers we have, and this is getting into the weeds, so I'll make it quick, but the newspapers actually sometimes were eager to solicit follow-up advertisements from Black advertisers who had found their families. And you can almost, and you can sort of see that as sort of a modern day kind of way to, right, to sell the newspapers, right? Listen, like if people who are advertising in this Richmond newspaper are finding people. So we have some of these follow-up ads that say something like, well, I'm placing this advertisement to thank the Richmond Recorder for helping me find my family. So there are those sort of economic considerations in place, both for free people who had to scrape up the dough to do that, to take out an ad, but also for Black, editors, oftentimes who are also pastors, and the churches that are affiliated with these newspapers.
Before we get to the main heroes of this book, I want to ask just a couple quick questions about how you put this all together and how you found and are finding all these sources. Reading the ads for me was really tough. I went through a few of them on your website. They're searchable on your website, which is really helpful, and what a resource that is. And I have some questions about that. But it's proof that this is real, and it happened in our country, and it happened for generations. The people looking were doing what any of us would do, and in a different racial system, it could have been any of us. When did you first start to notice these ads and say, maybe I've got something here?
I first noticed the advertisements when I was researching another book years ago, and I was sitting in my university library using a subscription database to read the newspapers from Philadelphia and from other places. I was doing a study. I was researching sort of, what was the experience of women in urban areas during the Civil War. So I was looking at the newspapers, and on a subscription database, and I kept seeing the advertisements, and this was more than 10 years ago. And I did not at that time, I had never been exposed to them. I didn't know that they existed. And they were just sort of, jumping off the page with the details of these families that I knew that that sort of documentation for Black family life doesn't exist in federal records. Enslaved people don't show up as people until the 1870 census, and all of these advertisements were describing families that existed in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, or even earlier than that. And so they clearly had a value to at least two or three different audiences.
Hmm.
And at the time, what struck me most about them is that they contain genealogical information for the descendants of the people named in them, who I couldn't imagine sort of walking into a university library and logging onto a computer and getting access to this pay for this profit-based subscription database that we have at a place like Villanova because it's a research institution. And so I just began clipping them, not really knowing what I would, how I would do it. But what I wanted to do is make them available to the descendants of enslaved people, right? So they didn't have to do that. So they didn't have to pay for to find this information about their families.
Are you picking up physical newspapers and going to archives, or are these available on newspapers.com if you know where to look and how to look?
The way that we have done this work is we've done this work by surveying available Black newspapers that we can get through microfilm. So that's the way we have done it, is the very old school mid 20th century technology of sitting at microfilm readers and reading the newspapers. We do that for a few reasons. One, because if we are harvesting any of these things from a pay per service like newspapers.com, then we actually have to pay newspapers.com to do them, to use them. And so we have not used any of those. We've just
Interesting,
gone
yeah.
old school. And we started with a comprehensive list of all the Black newspapers that we knew existed between sort of 1840, 1850, all the way to 1900. And we're just slowly but surely going through that list. And some of them, since we started this project, have been digitized in other places, and archives have digitized them, or some of them have shown up at Library of Congress, and that's great. Because all of those places are free, and so we don't get any of the ads from places where, right, because if we have to pay for them, then users would have to pay for
Mm.
them. All of
Um,
the advertisements are free.
I pulled this off of your website, but it says launched in 2017. So you've been doing this 8 years now. Last seen initially aimed to publish 1,000 ads from a handful of newspapers published in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, to help document this transition from slavery to freedom. The project now includes over 3,500 ads spanning 8 decades from 275 newspapers. Our goal is to publish 5,000 ads. How far is this going to go? The number seems to be increasing the more you find. Is there any way of guessing as to how many of these ads might still be out there?
Sure, and we need to update what you read because
Oh,
we're actually closing in on 4,900. We have more
uh,
than 4,800 advertisements in the collection now, and from more than 300 newspapers. And we know from user data that the site has been accessed more than 16 million times by something like 350,000 unique users. The last number I'm not sure of. So the project has grown well beyond whatever sort of modest expectations we had at the very beginning. And at the very beginning, we didn't know really, we had no idea what the sort of universe of these ads was, or how many places or how long we would continue to find them. So it has grown as we have addressed audiences of Black genealogists at the very beginning who told us that we really were looking in too few places. And so some of the first times we met with Black genealogists and said, look, this is stuff, we think we can, you'll find it useful. And how can we make the website responsive to the way that you would use it? And so the website has grown and been refined because we want to make it easier for people to find their family members. But we didn't think to even look in places like the Chicago Defender because they were so late. Like it was into the 20th century. We were like, I don't think so. But we looked, and sure enough, they were there. So to answer your question, we know we're not looking, at least at this moment, at anything beyond 1920. That's our sort of hard cutoff for looking. Just because, demographics, we don't expect that many people to be alive
people would
anymore.
have deceased by that
Right,
time.
they're
Yeah.
dead, or they're dying. So we're just not looking, beyond that. But we're not done with all the black newspapers, the extant black newspapers that we can access. We're not done with them yet. So we likely, we expect to reach our 5,000, which was our sort of new, right, our new expectation after we realized that 1,000 was not going to cut it. We sort of, pie in the sky said, let's see if we can get to 5,000. We'll get there. And the sad part of all of this is that the federal agency that funds us through the National Archives is not funding. Their funding has ceased at this moment because of personnel, because they lost a lot of people, and they're not sure that they can continue to operate. So our federal funding is now over. So the future of the project is very much in question.
Wow. Um, what do you hope a well, first of all, I should say the most important thing is for the descendants of these slaves to have access to this archive, obviously, because this is their families that we're talking about. But what do you hope a contemporary person? We're all bombarded by so much information, second by second. Someone who comes across this site, what do you hope they leave with an understanding of?
So that you mentioned earlier that the ads are hard to read. It's hard to read when being a human, and imagining what it would be like to lose a child, or to lose a spouse, or a mother, and that's really hard to read. On the other hand, the advertisements are full of hope, and love. The advertisements are a testament to love that endured unspeakable violence, um, you know, um, and many miles of distance and many years of separation, yet that love is still strong and it just jumps off the page in these advertisements. And as I was writing this book, I was constantly reminded of just how much people loved one another, and hoped, and the love fed that hope that they would find each other. So it's also deeply hopeful, and I think that's important. I feel like we're at a moment where this kind of really hard history, and that focuses on sort of the darker chapters of U.S. history, is suddenly in question, and people are trying to avoid it and evade it and cover it up. Yet these, the people who wrote these advertisements were at a similar moment when people were trying to forget about slavery, and cover over it with a comfortable story. Yet they persisted and they told their stories in the newspapers, and and those stories were about deep and abiding love for one another, and the hope that they would find each other again. And I find that to be a really important message that we, that I hold on to right now, and I hope other people will as well.
There are three heroes, at least three heroes in this book. I want to have you just describe each of them because they should get their due on this episode, even though we've talked and talked, and we've used almost all of our time. But the three heroes, Clara Bishop was looking for her daughter, Patience. Hagar Outlaw, who you mentioned, was separated from nine children, but found three of them. And then George and Beverly Tibbs spent decades searching for a brother who was separated from them at just 10 years old. Say what you want about these three people. What is important for us to know about each of these stories?
Yeah, sure. I find those three stories, one thread that connects them is mobility, which is something that we haven't talked about yet, but Clara Bashop, who starts the book off, was originally enslaved in Virginia, and then with her two children, and then is sold away from them into Mississippi, and she becomes free there, and then she spends the rest of her life traveling the country trying to find her daughter Patience, and she takes out ads at various places where she is searching for Patience. And she, and she says in her own ad that she sort of saved up her money and her, sort of got herself ready. So she didn't immediately leave Mississippi. But once she did, she continued to sort of retrace her steps to see if she could find her daughter from whom she'd been sold away decades before. And her story is how she sort of committed to doing this through both the medium of newspapers, but also simply moving around the country and on her own volition, right, on her own time to try to find patients, and also her son, who doesn't really get any airtime in the white newspapers, but Clara Bashop is searching for both of them. And then Hagar Outlaw is sort of the opposite in that way, because she never leaves North Carolina. Her children are sold everywhere, but she stays in North Carolina in close proximity to the man who sold away her children, and she's calling them to her. And she is, so she is sort of using the reversed technique of sort of staying in place with the name of the enslaver and sort of marking her spot so others can find her. And that works for her. Clara Bashop, we have no evidence that she ever finds patients. Um, we know that Hagar Outlaw finds 3 of the 9 children that she's looking for, and it might have helped that she sort of stays in place where names are familiar and people are able to find her. And then finally, we have George and Beverly Tibbs, who, George enlists in the U.S. Colored Troops, and they are enslaved in Virginia. He enlists in the Army. He is quite mobile when he's in the Army, and then he winds up in New Jersey. He winds up in New Jersey, and then Beverly, his brother, winds up in Massachusetts, and he works for the railroad. And so they're they're in the early 20th century. They're middle-aged men, and they are looking for their brother Lias, who was separated from them in Virginia when he was like 10 years old. So this is a separation of likely 40 years. Yet these 2 brothers, one in Massachusetts and one in New Jersey, they're both searching for Elias from these places that show sort of the mobility of formerly enslaved people during freedom. So they both leave the South and wind up someplace else where they're part of a Black community, and yet reaching out for a brother who, right, they don't know where he is or whether he survives, but they continue to search for him.
How did you settle on these 3 stories? Obviously, you probably couldn't write a book about most of these ads because evidence would have been hard to find. What led you to this evidence for their lives to piece all this together? And why were these the 3 that just seemed to jump out and say, I've got enough to grab onto a book here or to make a book here? And where was all this evidence?
Yeah, so there are 10 stories altogether in the book, but there's so many more stories that I started to research, or so many people's, histories that I started to research, probably twice as many that didn't make it in the book for the reasons that you mentioned, because it can be very hard to trace some of, the evidence from the advertisements. Names, last names are really hard to spell, and sometimes an advertisement can spell in 3 different ways, or people change their names, so it can be very tricky and very difficult to find them. So I chose the stories that wind up in the book are the ones that I could find the people likely, in the closest census to when they took out the advertisement. I could find them, and then that was a good omen, or that was that was an indication that that from that I could then follow the evidence from both the advertisement and a census to put them in place, and to be convinced that I had found the right person. Sometimes the names were so difficult, because they were so common, that I could never find what I felt comfortable sort of telling that story with integrity, that I had found the right people. So that was the first question. And then it also helps too, in George's case, George Tibbs's case, is because, he left the other records too. He applied for a federal pension for his service in the United States Colored Troops. His wife also. So there's all this other evidence that I have in order to tell the family's story. So that fills out the information about their separation. and the timing of their separation, because the ads are not as detailed, but the pension does. So from the pension, I learn more about sort of potentially when George, enlists in the army. Um, so yeah, so or in Hagar Outlaw's case, she also applies for food assistance from the Freedmen's Bureau. So that allows me to see sort of what her household looks like and right how many mouths she's feeding, and that fills out her story a little bit more if there's other records there that allow me to tell that story.
You mentioned the 4,900 ads. Do we have any way of knowing the success rate of these ads? How many of these ads actually worked?
The real truth here is we don't know, unless we do what I did in this book, which is to follow the evidence where it'll take us. And I wrote the book because as we talk about this project with people, the question that people always ask is that question: is did they find their people? And one way we answer it, which is not it's not really comforting, and it's not really what people are asking. We know of the 4,900 advertisements, we have about 100 of them mention that they found somebody. That doesn't tell us how many people were successful. It simply tells us that, right? That sometimes people did write to the newspapers and say, "Hey, I found somebody."
Mm.
Right? But that number is likely not representative of the experience. So we really don't know. Based on what we have in the database, the numbers it could be as low as 2%, which is what we're looking at in the database. But really, until we follow the evidence, we follow the breadcrumbs that they give us in the advertisements and go into all the other sources, we wouldn't know. But the work continues. In fact, Evan, just last week, a librarian at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts, found a follow-up advertisement to another brother who was looking for two of his brothers. She found a newspaper article that describes their reunion.
150 years later.
Yeah, we just found out last week. She said, so the American Antiquarian Society actually digitizes a lot of their records and gives them to newspapers.com. They have an agreement with newspapers.com. But she said, listen, I'm in the archive. There are all these newspapers that have not been digitized. So that gets back to your question. So she's
Yeah.
actually looking at the physical newspapers, and she says, I'm seeing ads here. Would you like them on the database? And of course, we immediately arranged for her to have access to the database, and she started uploading ads, and she found one of them. She found the names in the database and realized she was looking at the same people, and they found one another. And like you said, that's, 150 years later, people are getting their happy endings.
Couple questions to wrap things up with here. First, I just want to ask, what are some useful physical sites that we can visit for people who want to learn more about the slave trade? What do you think are the important places to visit to get a sense of the reality of what people lived in the 1800s and certainly before that?
Yeah, well, we're at a moment where there's a lot of really good, database, or there's a lot of really good websites out there that can give us, the fuller story of what the slave trade was and how it was experienced. So there are projects now that are tracing, the evidence of the coastwise slave trade. So that's sort of people who are not being forced marched through the interior, but actually being sold, who are being shipped by ship, by boat. And so that creates more paper trails because people have to, insure these boats, and they sort of have these dockets of people who are on them, and those are great. That's a great resource to, at least for finding names and things like that. I think that's great. There's also a new project to sort of just trace people from one state or another. There are a lot of those projects. There's one in Virginia, for instance, just looking at people who are being sold from Virginia. And then, as far as sort of the reality of what slavery was and how people experienced it, I think you can't go wrong by looking at the Federal Writers Project, WPA interviews with formerly enslaved people. These are these are elderly people in the 1930s who are being, interviewed by out of work federal workers who are talking to them about what they remember about slavery. And those are really evocative. The website, it's not easy to get through that. It's not sort of user friendly, but it's a great, really, really one of a kind resource to sort of thinking about, what people remember from it and people who survived it. And it's an extraordinary source. And there are many, many more. We're at a really important moment, I think, in being able to tell this story, with integrity and with an eye to sort of bringing the experience of these survivors to life.
Uh,
So,
you might not have succeeded at this yet, but I want to ask, how do we get our heads to a place where we can internalize the fact that slavery is as real as some of the good things that have happened in this country? And I don't know if you know the answer. I mean, that's a hard question, and you've probably spent a lifetime. You have spent a lifetime researching this, and it's a hard place to get to.
yeah, it is hard. And, I think that's why the stories told in these advertisements are so important because, y- you know, there are a million stories in these 5,000 ads of people who are doing what they can to try to keep their families together, to resist the institution, to survive the institution. And, you know, you might be able to sort of um, kind of ignore or kind of overlook one or two or whatever you're exposed to or how many of these stories you've read. You might be able to sort of compartmentalize them in a way, so that you're comfortable with this story and sort of putting it away in a safe place. But when you read about all of these people and all of the lengths that they went to try to sort of put back together their families and again just to survive the institution and then live their lives afterward, it's really it's hard to deny the reality of what slavery was as an institution and the sort of long shadow it continued to cast over those people who had survived it.
If you've heard this, if you've listened to this podcast for the 5 years, just about 5 years I've been doing this now, you know that I love asking authors about their dedications. So I want to ask you, your dedication is for Marisol because it's her turn and because I can't imagine what I would do if I lost her. An interesting way to get into the topic of this book, I guess. Why did you write that? Who is Marisol? And what was your message to her?
Marisol's my daughter. And when I was writing this book, and thank you for that question. When I was writing this book, and I hope as people are reading this book, that you imagine what it would feel like if you were ever in a position to not see somebody who you love or to believe that you might not ever see them again. And that is and that is an awful feeling. And so as I was writing this book and my daughter was growing up, as because books, they take a long time, right? And and I saw her, or I saw me, and her through advertisements of mothers, or children saying things like, I was separated from my mother when I could just crawl. And I'm thinking of Marisol, who is 16 now, but when I first started to find these ads was 5 or 6, and you imagine what it would be like to live all those years not knowing where she is or what she looks like, or and it's just yeah, it gets you in that spot that we all have relationships like that, and to think about what it would mean to you to go through that experience, right, makes this work meaningful. It also makes it hard sometimes, but it also makes it rewarding when you can say, when I can say to her, that right, that my that I feel the same way to you as I know people in these advertisements felt with their children, right? That they would do anything, and they would continue searching forever if they,
and
yeah, if they
and it
had
was
to.
her turn because she hadn't had a book dedicated to her yet.
Right. She has two brothers.
Okay, I was just curious.
She has two brothers. And the
Oh,
last,
there you go.
yeah, the last book the last book was about pornography during the Civil War. And I had two teenagers.
I had a question about that, but I didn't have it. I was running out of time. But go ahead, say what you want about
No,
this.
I did. I did. So, in within the family, the story is that the book about porn that I published years ago. I had two teenage boys at home, and I dedicated to them. And I said, I know they will love that. That their mother dedicated this book on porn to them, and of course they hated it, that was the whole idea. That was what I was doing. That's exactly right. Any parent of a teen will say that's exactly why you do things. But Marisol wasn't around then, so it was her turn to have a book.
Oh my goodness.
To
How do we beat that? How do we beat this? What's next? Have you decided if you'll do anything more? Any other books?
I'm not sure yet. As I've been talking about the book in different places, people have all said to me, I've heard this a lot, like, you need to keep writing more of this. You need to do more of this. I'm not sure if I will. I'll continue to work on the project as long as I can, and find more of these advertisements. And I know there'll be a lot more projects like this. I hope, right, that more people will go into the archive and recover some of these stories and tell them because they're extraordinary. What I will do next, I'm not exactly sure. I have a few things in mind, but nothing that's really, nothing that's ready for prime time.
There you go. Dr. Judith Giesberg, the author of Last Seen, The Enduring Search by Formerly Enslaved People to Find Their Lost Families. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Evan.
Check out the book and the Last Seen website, which is at informationwanted.org. She's on the website formerly known as Twitter at @jgiesberg. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity that promotes children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.